This one. Okay. One more minute, I guess. This light, can someone just, yeah, okay. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Hamid Rashid. I'm the chairman of Global AI. We are one of the partners and co-producer of the Barometer report that was launched the day before yesterday. And just for my background, I used to be the head of global macro at the United Nations, and I stepped down mid last year and joined Global AI. And as a knowledge partner of the Future Minerals Forum, we co-produced this report alongside McKinsey, as S&P Global, and GlobeScan. So this was a tri-continental effort on our part. And what we would present today, this morning, is basically the fact base of the report. That doesn't mean that other parts of the report are not factual, but this is the baseline that would show in terms of what's happening to the sector in the super region, and would zoom into 5 corridors in the African continent. So before I'm sure you've seen this slide before. This is the FMF framework. We are talking about the 6 enablers that were identified by the FMF Ministerial Roundtable. We're talking about policy and regulations. We're talking about financing, sustainability, infrastructure, talent, and technology. These are the 6 critical enablers that would let this sector develop in the super region. I'll give an update on each and every one of those enablers and where they stand right now in terms of building a resilient supply chain across the super region. But before we dive into the corridors, critical mineral corridors, let me give you a brief macroeconomic outlook, which is the sort of backdrop for the discussion that we are having today. So, global economy is facing some uncertainties at this stage. The economy is expected to grow by 3.1% in 2026, slight weakening of the global growth. That's when we are writing the report, but maybe it would be adjusted a little bit more downward. And there are some significant headwinds in the major economies, including in China, in the US, and other parts of the world as well, especially in the developed countries. But in contrast, the Middle East and Central Asia, these economies are looking better than most of their counterparts in the developing world. If you look at it, the countries in the Middle East and Central Asia region, they're projected to grow by 3.6% in 2026, up from 2.6% in 2024. This is a major uptake for this region. One of the reasons that we would see this growth uptake in the Middle East and Central Asia is that commodity prices are expected to remain strong. Some of the key commodities, we're talking about non-oil commodities, expected to increase by 11.5% in the next 2 years, but this within the 2 years. And 2 factors are playing a role here, both positive and negative. One is the dollar remains very weak, and weak dollar basically helps commodity prices. But on the other hand, it affects investment, because investment becomes more costly, especially foreign investment. And other is high interest rates. The policy uncertainties regarding interest rates remain significant in terms whether the Fed, US Federal Reserve, would lower the rates is an issue here. But we foresee that interest rate would probably remain high in the foreseeable future, and that would drag investments to a large extent. And in addition to policy uncertainties, you also have significant geopolitical uncertainties, and that is another challenge that would affect the prospects for these countries in the super region and beyond. That if we go now, what is the super region? We're roughly talking about 75 countries, the whole of Africa, and then Central Asia, and also the some of the countries from Latin America. But key issue here that these countries are major source of supplies of the critical minerals. For example, if you take a look at cobalt or tantalum or manganese, more than 50% of the supply comes from the super region. But that's also another important fact about the super region is that these countries are heavily dependent on commodities, commodity exports. 1/3 of the countries, that is 25 of them, exports, if you look at the export basket, 40% of their total export comes from commodities. That's significant. And if you look at some of the countries, especially countries in Africa, like Zambia, 78%. If you look at Guinea, 87% of their export comes from minerals and metals. So they're heavily dependent on commodities, which is mining and metals and minerals. And this dependence makes them, it's a blessing in this current context because commodity prices are rising, but it's also a challenge in terms of making sure these economies have more local value addition, local beneficiation. Without that, economic growth would face challenges. Now we would dig slightly deeper about the countries that we're focusing on in this report, this version of the report. So we are talking about 6 minerals corridors, and out of the 6, actually, we zoom in onto 5. We don't discuss this year on the lithium triangle between Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. So these are the 5 priority corridors that we discuss in the report, and most of our analytical work is on those 5 corridors. And if you look at it, copper corridor, there are 2 countries, Zambia and DRC. You have graphite corridor, Mozambique and Tanzania, and then you have 3T corridor, tantalum, tin, and tungsten. You have Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, and Uganda. And then you have multi-metal corridor, which is South Africa, and Namibia, Botswana. And finally, you have the iron bauxite corridor, Mali, Sierra Leone, then you have Guinea, and in addition, you have 2 other countries, Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. And together, these countries actually, if you put them, these 15 countries together, their GDP is about almost $1 trillion. So it's a fairly large GDP and in terms of population as well. And they are the main sources, the main drivers of the critical minerals supply chain. So that's why our focus this year is on those 5 corridors. We're excluding lithium triangle. In future, we'll probably come back and look at also what's happening in the lithium triangle in Latin America. So first, enabler that we look at is the policies and regulations. Where do the countries stand in terms of their standing and the policy performance? We develop a composite index of policy performance. We look at their level of economic development, which is GDP per capita, which is a good proxy, and we look at the policy framework in terms of fiscal policy. We look at monetary policy and exchange rate policies, and we look at debt policies. How do they manage external debt? Because these 3 policies really affect their economic performance. And we build a composite index based on these 4 indicators and rank the countries in a scale of 1 to 5. And it shouldn't come as a surprise, countries in the multi-metal corridor, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, their policy performance is, in terms of the index that we develop, they have quite a bit of, you won't see it here, but we have another slide where they have a strong policy framework. But in terms of economic growth, we look at the growth in the last 10 years, what happened in those corridors, and we project what are the likely growth scenarios for the next 5 years. That's how we compare the country's performance. And if you look at it, countries in the multi-metal corridor, which I'm focusing on, which those 3 countries, last 10 years, their performance was relatively very weak, partly because of high unemployment rate in South Africa, other challenges in Botswana and Namibia. But we see a significant improvement from that very low baseline to 3.3% average growth rate. The blue bars are the projections, and the green ones are the past performance in terms of GDP growth. What is important for us to know that these corridor countries are one of the fastest growing economies, not only in Africa, but also around the world among their peers. Like if you look at Rwanda, if you look at Guinea, many of them have been growing over 6% per year for 10 years. In the African context, this is a fairly high growth performance. Many countries in Africa have been growing relatively slow. If you look at what we are projecting right now, like iron bauxite economies, they are projected to grow very fast. They would grow by as high as 6.7% in the next 5-year period, 2025 to 2030. But one part of the policy challenges is the economic integration, how integrated these economies are within themselves. There we see a significant challenge, although they're neighboring countries, but there's very little trade between them and among them. The only fully quite integrated economy is the multi-metal corridor countries, South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia. They have significant intra-corridor trade. Others, if you look at some of them, their percentage, for example, 3T corridor, the 3 countries we're looking at, Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda, only 1% of their global trade is amongst themselves. 99% is with outside partners. So very little intra. So although we are talking hypothetically, we're trying to see these countries as integrated, but they're not really integrated through trade. And one of the challenges for them to be integrated is that their logistics performance index is very low. And this is the world average of logistics performance of 2.4, which is a measure developed by the World Bank. And we applied this across countries, and you see all the countries, except for the multi-metal corridor countries, are below the global average. And that is where the challenge lies, because logistics is very weak. And if you want to build a corridor where supply chain are integrated, you need better logistics, better customs clearance, better port facilities, better road network. Those are absent in these corridor countries. Then we look at also how integrated they are with the rest of the world economies, openness and connectedness. We look at 2 measures. One is openness score that is available from World Openness Report, and we look at DHI, New York University, also a score. That 2 scores basically again show there's not much variation across countries, but they're not very open to the rest of the world economies, except for the multi-metal corridor countries. They're more integrated, they have better port facilities, and they have significant international trade, whereas other countries are less integrated to the world economy. One important factor to keep in mind is that 6 out of those 15 countries are landlocked. That becomes a challenge for them because Zambia, for example, is landlocked. You have Mali, which is also landlocked. Rwanda, Burundi are also landlocked. That poses a significant challenge in terms of their economic integration with the rest of the world economy. So, in terms of the state of their policy and performance, we see there's a lot of room for improvement. They're not there, they're not fully integrated. Even within the region, there's not enough trade. And this is where we would like to see in future, the Future Minerals Forum plays a role to improve the economic integration within the corridor countries. Okay, next slide. Yeah. Then the next slide, we're looking at the key enabler for economic growth, and more specifically, driving the critical mineral sector development. And there you see, again, one of the significant factors is the greenfield investments, what is happening to the region. Globally, 2024 was not a good year for FDI flows. FDI flows actually suffered significant, there are a lot of mergers and acquisition, but not FDI in the narrowest sense because of several factors. One was, of course, slowing economic growth, high interest rates. So FDI suffered significant slowdown in 2024. And one of the key drivers of FDI slowdown is that most of the investments flew into or went into data centers. So data centers are sprouting everywhere in North America, in China. So you see all the money is going into building data centers. But you need a lot of metals and minerals upstream to build the data centers, but you didn't see that enough investments upstream, but most of the investments went downstream. And more importantly, greenfield investments in the mineral sector, these economies that we're looking at, they suffered a significant slowdown, 43% decline in 2024. And that is what really worries us in terms of how we would see in the next few years, whether there will be a reversal of the trend, because greenfield investments is what is needed to open new mines or support new exploration activities, and also to build more processing and refining facilities within the continent, within the corridor countries. And this is where we see significant challenges going forward, because part of the factor is the cost of capital and the risk perceptions about those countries. Many of the countries had either a conflict history, like in West Africa or in DRC, and still there's quite a bit of challenge in terms of bringing investment to those economies, and lack of infrastructure also is a major factor. We'll look at in the next slide. So it's not just external factors, but also domestic factors are playing a very important role in terms of a slowdown in investments. But even from a low base, we see a further erosion in FDI inflows and greenfield investments. It's not that they had very large flows in the past. Flows are always very sporadic and sometimes, ups and downs, but we saw a sharp decline in 2024. Infrastructure, of course, there's a chicken and egg problem there, because you need infrastructure to attract investments, but you need investments to build infrastructure too, because there's not enough domestic savings in those countries to build very significant sort of world-class infrastructure that is needed to attract a lot of investments, especially in midstream. Upstream investments, one investor can take a risk in opening a mine, but processing and refining requires a lot more investments and a lot more sort of infrastructures. And one of the key determinants of midstream beneficiation is energy, electricity consumption, and this or generation per person. And if you look at, this is probably the most shocking slide. If you look at the world average of electricity generation per person basis, it's 3,639. And the only country that's only of the 5 corridors that we're looking at, only the multi-metal corridor is close to the world average, still not the world average. But if you look at the 3T corridor, their average electricity generation is 98 kilowatt per kilowatt hour, which is incredibly low even by the standard of the other countries in the region. So there's a lot of investment that will be needed to generate a lot of electricity. And without electricity, you cannot have a lot of beneficiation, because the entire discussion of a resilient supply chain is that how do you capture more value locally and regionally? And this is a challenge that countries would need to address in terms of attracting more investment. And it's not easy, because you need a lot of investment. So some of the countries have made quite a bit of progress. DRC is having an electricity deal with Angola, bringing some electricity. Zambia is a surplus, but still there's not enough generation in the regions, in the corridor countries, to meet the demand of investors would need far more security, not just geopolitical security, but energy security. And without energy security, it's very difficult to get the investment that is needed. I would not go into the details we have in the report. You can look at it. Ports, number of ports, number of other facilities that are needed. There's still a huge gap, except for, again, the multi-metal corridor, where you have fairly robust infrastructure compared to other corridor countries. How am I doing time-wise? Okay. And then, this is the good news part of the report. We see the countries are actually all the corridor countries, and we didn't want to treat the individual countries. We lump them by corridor, and you see almost all the corridor countries have taken significant measures to improve their sustainability commitment and also traceability. It's a major issue in mining and minerals, is that how traceable their production are. You can see that all the 5 corridors have taken new measures, and we looked at the new measures in terms of specific regulations or legislations. For example, Rwanda has taken stringent measures against child labor in the mining sector. In iron bauxite corridor countries, you see a significant improvement in terms of monitoring of mining activities. Mining inspectors' offices are created, and this happened over the last 2 years. And we can attribute this success also to the discussions we are having in the MRT, Ministerial Roundtable discussions that under the FMF. So we see quite a bit of progress in terms of having more commitment to sustainability standards, more commitment to improve traceability, but still in terms of quality of policy and institutions that are responsible for implementation of those standards, still they are fairly inadequate. And you can see that the score that we have is called Quality of Policy and Institutions for Environmental Sustainability. And in a scale of 5, none of the countries are above 4. You'd expect those institutions to be more robust and more resourced to enforce those standards. So you can make standards available, make strong commitments, but without enforcement, without actual implementation of those standards, still investors would be very, I would say, hesitant to put more money into those economies. So there's significant gaps in terms of policies and institutions, enforcement from the enforcement side, not from the commitment side. And we look at the trend, and we actually look back before 2023, we see this trend is upward in terms of there's greater awareness among the countries that they need to improve those standards to attract investment. And we believe this trend would continue alongside more emphasis on actual implementation of those standards. And in future iteration of the report would look at not just what they have said, but also what is the commitment, what is the implementation rate of those measures. Last two enablers are very interrelated. One is talent development or human capital, because we may have the infrastructure, we may have the policy, but if you don't have the people to be employed in those sectors, especially in the midstream activities, it's very difficult to get investment. So investors not only look for policy predictability, not only infrastructure, right kind of infrastructure, but they also want to have the right set of people. And this is where FMF is emphasizing a lot on talent development, local talent development. How do you make sure that you have the right skill sets to make sure the investors feel that they would be able to get the local talent to work in those beneficiation projects? There, we are looking at two indicators. One is a very known indicator called Human Capital Index, and other is the percentage of people with upper secondary education. Again, you see there's quite a bit of heterogeneity across the 5 corridor countries. If you look at the graphite corridor comprising Tanzania and Mozambique, only 8.2% of the adult population have higher secondary education, compared to 43.7% in multi-metal corridor. So if we expect that Mozambique or Tanzania would have same level of investment compared to South Africa, it's unrealistic, because the skills are not there. Even the basic education levels are not there. So there's a huge gap, and we need more alignment, more harmonization of those, like human capital, because that would be the ultimate draw. Because Africa, as we heard from many presentations yesterday, that this is a relatively young continent, and you need to have the right talent in place, especially in the mining and mineral sector, to make sure that investors feel confident to come in and work with the local experts and local technicians, local employees. So we'll track this indicator very closely, and we'll look at sub-indicators within those skills category to make sure that the FMF report in future actually provides more granular data on human capital. The last enabler that we look at is again, very related technology. And technology is something very amorphous. You don't have an exact indicator that you can say, okay, this is a technology indicator. In future, would look at productivity measures and other variables, but this iteration, we looked at number of engineers per 1,000 adults and see where the countries stand. Again, none of the countries have a significant number of skilled professionals who can actually, because when you have skilled professionals, technology transfer becomes easier. They acquire new understanding of a joint venture, and they can say, okay, we can implement it ourselves. There's a lot of positive spillover effect across the economy. But if you don't have the local skill sets, it's very difficult to have technology transfer. A foreign investor would come in, they would invest, they would run their plant, but there'll be no spillover effect, positive spillover effect. And this is where we see quite a bit of challenge. I think I should finish very quickly. And other things, that number of mining and related institutions in those countries, in terms of mining schools or universities that are dedicated to mining research, mining technology. And there also you see that multi-metal corridor and iron bauxite corridor, these are the two corridors. Actually, if you look at the countries within those corridors, South Africa, of course, is a leading mining economy, and there's a huge investment in technology and engineering schools, mining schools in South Africa and also in Cote d'Ivoire. But if you take those two countries out, the actual average is very, very low for those countries. And this is where a lot of investment will be needed going forward to build the local hubs for excellence and to make sure those local players can actually adopt the foreign technology and to improve their local capacity for value addition. I think this is my last slide, so I'm open for any question that you may have at this point. Thank you. Yes, Chris?
So the FDI numbers are shocking in 2024. And what's your sense of 2025? Probably worse.
2025 is probably worse because you saw, again, all the money flowing into, if you look at the US, almost 90% of non-residential investments in the US in 2025 went into data centers. So very little, and that, which is basically global capital pool, is fairly integrated. Money flows into one sector means there's less available in other sectors of the economy. So when the US investors were pulling out of investments in Africa or Latin America, they were putting more money in the data centers in Arizona or in Texas. So that is where you see the zero-sum game. Yes, I think this 25 number would be even worse. But if you look at the US numbers of aggregate investment, it actually went up significantly, partly because of the demand for data centers.
And the irony of that is that, of course, we need the corridor to speed these data centers.
Yes, and exactly. So basically, if you look at, I was just doing a back-of-the-envelope calculation. To have 1 gigawatts of data center capacity, you need about between 30 and 50,000 tons of copper alone. Forget about other metals. And last year alone in the US, in 2025, there was about 63 gigawatts of data centers that were added to the pool. So you're talking about US alone, actually, unanticipated demand for copper was about 2.53 million tons. That was not actually expected by the market. That's why the copper prices went up significantly, because this demand is just coming unexpectedly. If it was planned, like if it was the long-term trend, all of it, then it would have been fine. Market would have responded just by increasing the supply. But the supply couldn't keep up with the demand that is surging in the US for data centers. And also in China, not only in the US, also in Europe. Any other question? Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
Okay, hi everybody, welcome. My name is Chris Coulter, I'm the CEO of GlobeScan. We're an insights and advisory firm, and we had the pleasure and honor of making a contribution to the FMF Barometer Report 2025. And what I will do is go through some of the research we did, which was involving stakeholder interviews to get a sense of what is the state of readiness for all of the enablers required to drive demand and supply in the proper way. And building on where Hamid just left off, we can kind of fill in some advice and perspectives from experts on what we have to do to enable the super corridor. So I'll talk about three things, but first I want to give a bit of context of why we were doing this research and what we'll be doing going forward, some feedback from stakeholders on these critical enablers, and then a few conclusions, and then we can chat and have any conversation. So first of all, going forward for the barometer, there will be an annual survey of stakeholders in the super region and outside, among investors, policymakers, corporations, academics, experts, et cetera, to assess and give feedback on the progress required around what's working, what isn't, and then can we dissect and diagnose different opportunities for stronger performance across the super region. So this feedback is critical because it allows the inclusivity and perspectives of people on the ground inside super region countries, and also those externally who are looking at investment opportunities, growth opportunities, catalyzing the value chain. So that is coming in a quantitative annual way to track in a barometer type fashion. What we did this year was we did these in-depth interviews with stakeholders across the world to understand their perspective, some of how they see the enablers, what's working so far, and all of that will feed into this quantification of sentiment among stakeholders across the region and outside. And we're excited about this launch of the survey next year, which will, again, give that reinforcing sense of confidence, what's working, where are the challenges, and how might we address them. So that's to come in 2026. But let's look at what stakeholders are thinking. So we spoke to 41 experts across the world. We had hour-long, in-depth conversations exploring all of the challenges and opportunities. It represents a multinational set of perspectives. We spoke with corporate leaders in the mining industry, downstream in the technology industry. We spoke to government officials and policymakers inside the super region at senior levels. We spoke to multilateral institutions to try and get a sense of how they see the opportunities in context of broader development issues. We spoke also to thought leaders and academics and industry associations to get a 360 perspective on what does all of these things look at and sort of the nuances and the complexities. And we assessed these 6 fundamental enablers that FMF identified through the conference last year. You're familiar with some of them, and they all make sense. Policy, critical, financing, infrastructure, sustainability, talent development, and technology. And the interdependence of these things and how they reinforce each other is quite fundamental. You can't treat these in silos because they overlap quite dramatically. So let's look at each of them at a time and what stakeholders said was required to try and enact and unlock the financing that's fundamental. So this is obviously key to progress. As Hamid just said, the foreign direct investments in the super region are quite minimal and have probably declined in the last couple of years. So we need to find a way to unlock finance. We have the challenge among investors in particular is all around risk, high risk, long-term returns, a lack of confidence in policy, a lack of confidence in the stability of the region. All of these things are fundamental and top of mind for investors. The requirement then to identify investors who appreciate and are able to commit to patient capital, long-term returns, understanding there's not a short-term feedback loop is really fundamental. And then how do we actually understand the other priorities of the region and the countries in the region to align the financing that way and pool resources where we can, in some cases, around other typical developments, infusions, and unlocking the super region. Fundamental, and you can see a little bit of a perspective from a stakeholder on financing. So financing, really important, obviously, and we have lots of capital, but finding ways to de-risk the capital flows are a priority. Policy is obviously critical. It's part of the de-risking process and what investors are looking for. And we see this, stakeholders give feedback that without proper policy that's not just on the books, but enforced, very little can happen going forward. And we see the inconsistency across the region on policy as a real obstacle, and trying to harmonize and create collaboration opportunities between governments and across the region, quite important and quite challenging. It requires more investment in collaboration, in dialogue, in deliberation, and I think a shared perspective among those outside the super region, particularly in Africa, and within the African continent to almost force the coherence of policy as a really important unlock going forward. And this harmonization is fundamental. We, of course, stakeholders gave advice that as we do that harmonization, we also have to be attentive of local nuance, cultural imperatives, national priorities for governments given the politics of policymaking. So really, really fundamental. Sustainability is one of the enablers. What was quite clear and perhaps a little bit unexpected, the degree to which stakeholders had alignment. Again, these are stakeholders from mainstream investing houses, pension funds, government officials inside the region, outside, multilateral institutions, academics, and global mining industry people. They all had a consistency of the necessity of sustainability and ESG, largely from a sense of this is the way to de-risk the opportunities in the sector and in the region, and it is a very powerful insurance policy to allow for the long-term returns to come to fruition. And I think many sophisticated approaches to ESG see it as a very powerful risk management lens, and there are existing policies and commitments on the books in the super region countries. The challenge is to drive more transparency around it, to drive more data and reporting, and to ensure enforcement of some of those policies. One of the challenges, of course, is the multiplication of requirements around compliance on ESG and the variability. So how do we find ways to harmonize those as well? It's aligned quite closely with policy. And can we adopt, for example, ICMM, the International Council of Minerals and Mining and Minerals, their one standard on mining around ESG, which would simplify the process, get rid of duplication, and allow for much better comparability. So those kinds of things could really drive, in a positive way, the value of sustainability as an enabler. Talent, we've heard at the conference quite substantially, there's a need for more investment in education in the super region. We need more STEM education in particular. We need more engineers. We need more centers of excellence to drive some of these things forward. And all of this allows for the infrastructure to be developed, for the technology to be deployed, and without this talent, and this talent gap is quite fundamental, we are unable to capture and deliver on the supply that the world requires on these critical minerals. I think Saudi Arabia is already playing an interesting role here in creating centers of excellence. I think if they can find ways to bring and train people from parts of the super region in Africa and Latin America, and again have that coherent set of education aligning with some of those policy obligations, and the technology deployment could be a quite powerful catalyst for the years to come. Infrastructure, Hamid, if you didn't see, just showed the massive gaps in infrastructure in some of these countries in Africa in particular, but also Latin America. We need huge amounts of investment going forward around logistics, energy, transport, connectivity. There are massive gaps. Many of these countries are landlocked, which means they don't have easy access to global markets, and there's deficiencies in some of the infrastructure. One of the challenges of financial and investment stakeholders saying, we need the infrastructure before we can invest. It's a chicken and egg phenomenon. We need the money before we build the infrastructure. So this is a very obvious and clear gap for stakeholders. And then the policy part of each country, and then the collaboration to develop infrastructure that goes across different borders is also identified as fundamental. And technology, very much like infrastructure, we know it exists across the world. It's expensive, it requires financing, it requires talent from the local population to leverage the technology. It's involved in exploration and mineral development. It has implications for the sustainability footprint of this mining. The more technology we can apply in the proper way, the more we're more efficient around energy usage and processing. And there's some big gap here, and leveraging things like AI is also something that's top of mind for stakeholders. So all of these things together get a sense of how integrated these different elements and how overlapping. And based on these stakeholder interviews, we have this sense of readiness, how effective are each of these enablers so far across the super region. We can see financing is understood. It's minimal, but we understand how to unlock it. It's sort of middling when it comes to readiness. Policy, when we investigate and explore and what stakeholders tell us, different governments, they have actually not bad policy. It's improving. There are corruption issues that we have to deal with, and there's enforcement issues on the policies. But there's opportunities to simplify, harmonize, and actually enable these, so that's powerful. Sustainability also has strong legs at the local governance level in these countries, on the books, theoretically. The application of these are important. And it is fundamental, I think, to both the financing and the policy when it comes to sustainability, because the ultimate customers of these critical minerals, downstream, OEMs, technology companies, have very clear, consistent policies on traceability and sourcing of their raw materials, and this also has to be understood. So it speaks to the long-termness of all of this conversation rather than some short-term way to extract minerals. Talent, infrastructure, and technology all are quite behind when it comes to readiness according to stakeholders, so we have lots of effort to apply to those enablers, and of course they can't happen without the right financing policy that has an ESG lens as well. Okay, I'll end and see if there's any questions, but a few quick comments. One is that the feedback from stakeholders was we need to create, almost psychologically as well as analytically, an ability to create confidence. And to do that, we have to package all 6 enablers with a clear direction and alignment and interdependence for these things to build up the confidence among investors, among policymakers, among global mining companies to see the opportunity and again to de-risk as much as possible. And so there's all kinds of different elements of how these things work together. Some important but obvious. The way we do this is multifaceted and at a high level. The amount of times all of these stakeholders reference and focus on risk, political risk, economic risk, the risk that other parts of that ecosystem and value chain won't do their part is very top of mind and tangible for these stakeholders. So we have to have a very forward-looking, explicit sense of the work we're all doing that we are de-risking, because that's what's top of mind, again, for lots of these important stakeholders. All of this is interdependent, as we've been saying. And the trust aspect is core, and we can only move as quickly as we can on one enabler at a time. If we miss one enabler, then everything slows down. So the speed of this requires the ability for all enablers to move, which means that all of the different actors in the ecosystem, from business, governments, civil society, academia, all has to move in concert, and trust is fundamental. So the ability to create opportunities for dialogue, to have a sense of where's to express what's working and what isn't working together and solve problems, and that's where collaboration is fundamental. We need, and all of the stakeholders referenced, we need more opportunities for collaboration. We need to coordinate and scale some of the collaborations we're doing. Without that, it's very difficult to de-risk or drive the process. And this great African proverb that's very apropos to this conversation is, if we are talking about going far rather than quickly in many cases when we're looking at this. This is a 30, 40-year initiative when we're talking about mining and developing assets. We need to be patient with those things, but we also need to reinforce the fact that all of these things have to happen together. And again, the collaborative, transparent, trusted approach is one of the secret sauces for our potential success collectively going forward. So next year we will have this deeper quantitative assessment across within the region and outside, so we'll look out for that. And I will stop here and see if there's any questions or comments to be had. Yes, please.
So for the survey, I suppose a lot of the information are textual data.
Yes.
How can you quantify this textual data into real index?
What kind of data?
Textual data.
Textual. Like,
Text data.
oh, tax data. Oh, that's a great question. So I think in some of those, when we will do the benchmarking from stakeholder feedback next year, we will include aspects like taxing and tax policy and what the performance of different countries on that basis to try and give feedback and assess. And we will look at a whole number of different attributes and then see which ones are driving trust and confidence in the region. So it'll be a part of the process. It's a great suggestion. Yes, please.
Which countries included in super region?
I'm sorry?
Which countries are included in super region?
So there's mostly in Africa and parts of West and Central Asia, but as well as a conversation in the southern cone of Latin America. So between 16 and 25 countries depending. But we will be looking at a country level and also an aggregate level to assess. We don't want to do it in a way that is like a report card and giving failing grades, but we do want to be real and provide feedback loops to stakeholders on which parts of the super region are doing well and aligned in the right way based on stakeholder feedback, ensuring that's inclusive so people within country are having their voice expressed on what they believe is going well and what changes, and that'll allow for, I think, clearer conversations among the value chain. Any other questions or comments? All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
name on it, but then it wasn't confirmed.
Yeah, no, I was put last minute actually,
Okay, good.
but happy to be here.
Thank you.
Who else?
The area, am I already on?
Not yet.
Okay. No, the area that I wanted to get your view on was technology, the progress on technology and traceability. Yeah?
Traceability of.
Critical mineral value chains. Yeah.
Where are you based? New York City. Lovely. Washington.
Yes, the mic is on.
That's good. Is this mic on? Yeah,
Yep,
it is.
yours is
Oh,
on
we
as
can
well.
hear you. Oh, they didn't give you a handheld.
No.
Are all the mics on?
Yep.
Yep.
Richard?
Yeah, sure it works. Yeah, it works.
I think we can get started. Let's take control.
Yeah. Are we ready to start?
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We have an interesting session here, and before we do that, I'm just going to get some introductions. So my name is Ageson. I'm a partner from McKinsey, lead our mining practice in Africa and work across the super region, actually. And I'll be moderating the session. So just introducing the rest of the panel.
Yes. So my name is Richard Rothenberg. I'm a CEO of Global AI Corporation based in New York. We're a big data and artificial intelligence company in the mining sector.
Thank you.
My name is Gracelyn Baskren. I'm the director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Mzila Mtenjana, CEO of Minerals Council South Africa, lobbying and advocacy body. It's an employer representative with about 70 members, and combined, they're responsible for about 6% of GDP contribution to South Africa's economy and 90% of South Africa's mineral production by sales. Thanks.
Thank you. So what are we here to talk about? Well, I think there's a big discussion around critical minerals, growth, what is it needed, what's the supply needed, value chains. There's been a lot of this discussion. And as part of that, the Future Minerals Forum, in convening the super region, has also developed a framework around critical minerals. Now, what's exciting about this that I haven't seen in many other places and many other frameworks is also a focus on accountability, acceleration, and execution. And as part of that, the Future Minerals Forum has developed an annual barometer, which shares the state of the sector, and through that a dashboard, which actually looks at progress being made, which is important because it actually leads to the discussion on what is the progress, where's the opportunity to accelerate, what are the unlocks to actually make all of this opportunity and need meet the requirements and expectations and potential. And so 8 projects that have started to be tracked along this are on financing, centers of excellence around innovation, policy, talent and R&D, and geology, and sustainability, and then traceability principles and the Future Minerals Accord. And so what we'd love to discuss and want to discuss with this group today is what are some of the insights and observations on how this is actually going, how the super region is making progress across these elements towards meeting some of the ambitions of the framework. And let me start with you, Mzila. And the first question I'd love to get a sense from each of the panelists is, what's your view on how this is all progressing across these elements?
I think, for me, from what I've seen, it's there's been progress, although to different measures across the elements that you have spoken about, but also different progress in different jurisdictions. But what has been encouraging for me is how, I think, just listening to what you've read out, Those are the same elements that I recall from the recent G20 that was held in South Africa, which were mentioned in the context of the critical minerals framework. And so I think what is happening is that there's a beginning to be some degree of convergence and more importantly, reinforcement of these issues in various dialogues. And so I think at some point it should all come together and we'll really then begin to see a lot more momentum building up on these things.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we're seeing the movement, and I think that's important. And what about you, Grayson?
I think we've seen so much progress, but I think we need to look at it through two different lanes. So one is the new focus on emerging markets in new mining jurisdictions, Africa, Central Asia, to some extent Latin America. And this is coming, a lot of these regions have historically been looked at from an aid lens, through a development lens, and now are coming front and center on commercial diplomacy, how do we get private sector investment? And a lot of this is because they are the source of the minerals, and they are the source of minerals that have the most potential in terms of undeveloped assets, new greenfield projects. So they are seen as the long-term bet. When you think of the fact that these projects may have a life of mine that sits between 40 to 100 plus years. The second lane are countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the US, EU, Australia, Canada, and these are places that are trying to secure minerals. And a lot of this is also rising from the current state of geopolitical tension. So you've found a newfound focus on financing. How do we use innovative financing? How do we develop new partnerships with some of these emerging countries? How do we invest in human capital? We were talking earlier, and we can come back to this, but in the US, we have 220,000 people retiring out of the mining workforce in the next few years. So you have a lot more focus on how do you secure minerals. So there's been a lot of progress both in how do we find the sources, and then how do we go and procure.
Yeah, makes sense. I think it's quite a balanced view, right? That there's been a big step in how we see some of these countries, but there's still a lot more to do in an integrated way. And Richard, what's your view? Is this making progress?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had the pleasure to work on the FMF barometer, and some interesting dynamics we saw is that the countries that make up this super region of the FMF comprise more than 80 countries that comprise more than 50% of the extraction globally of critical minerals. And we've seen critical challenges such as reduction of the foreign direct investment in critical projects going down more than 70% in the last couple years. This has been partially, in part due to constraints in energy production. There's very limited critical infrastructure in these FMS super region countries in the availability of energy and basic infrastructure. And part of it lies also with the limited financing and country risk factors. And for this purpose, we also see challenges and opportunity in terms of policy, how policy can be aligned with the investors' interest to catalyze these critical investments that are necessary to untap these massive resources in the region.
Thank you. And you mentioned policy, and Grayson, I want to start with you on, but going deeper in some of these project areas, right? And there's a policy center of excellence as part of this one of the projects that are quite important. What are you seeing in terms of progress there, and especially around how policy is helping or not helping on the investability in some of these corridors and jurisdictions?
So at the end of the day, governments are generally not miners, and it's better that way. We should let miners be miners. And when you think of it from that lens, the role of policy is to create an enabling environment for investment. It is one to give, and this is particularly important in newer jurisdictions or developing jurisdictions, but how do you have stability of policies? Miners can't operate on policies that, when you're thinking again about a 40 to 100 year investment, I can't live in fear that my policies are going to change in 1 year, a 1, 2, 3 year time horizon, or I'm not going to go in the first place, right? So we need policy stability. The second thing we need is government intervention. So the reason this is important, and I'll leave my American hat on here, is this past year saw an unprecedented amount of industrial policy. What we saw, for example, with the US MP Materials deal with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Ma'aden, et cetera, was that we used price support, we used equity, we used offtake, and this really helps a very nascent and early industry grow. People forget that, you know, it was decades before Honda actually cut a profit. Japan subsidized it for a long time. Nokia, we don't use Nokias anymore, but Finland once subsidized that until it was profitable. Historically, we've often supported early stage industries. So policy support and government mechanisms can de-risk those. So we can think about it again, creating the stability of the environment, but then also providing support until this industry becomes more economically viable. And then we leave miners to do what they're good at.
Yeah, yeah. And Mzila, do you think there's been progress on this?
So I think there has been, and it's probably going to continue to evolve. As Richard was talking, I was reminded that probably a decade or 15 years ago, some of the major mining companies made open declarations that they will only focus on OECD countries in exploration and finding of new commodities and growing their businesses. And I think that was just after what was then referred to as the exuberance of mining companies that we saw and coming out of the, some very high prices. And I think we're sitting here today where I think there's now a realization that actually the minerals are not going to come from OECD countries. The countries that have mineral endowment are the emerging economies. And so this is going to bring, and this is bringing together now governments, as illustrated by Graceland, and the major operators. And so there's a new era that is certainly emerging in terms of conversations and collaboration between private sector and public sector. And I think we're still going to go through a phase of discovery of what that collaboration looks like. It's not going to be I don't think it will be the same as what we've seen in the past. I think we've seen pockets of success in as far as how these two entities work together. But we're in a different realm now. If you look at the scale of investment that is required, the imperative to transition, and the scale of investment is not only in mining, it's also in the enabling infrastructure that is required. And then you have other emerging issues that are affecting mining. You know, the ESG. I think we're going to be hearing about the barometer later on, which I'm very keen to hear more about. Societal pressures on the ethical conduct of mining, societal pressures on the ethical conduct of politicians and policy. So there's just this melting pot, or in South Africa it's not a melting pot, we call it a potjiekos. Of a potjiekos pot of things that are just mixing, and that we have to actually learn to manage the complexity that comes out of that.
Yeah, makes sense. And I just wanted to touch on Richard, did you have a comment on this policy point?
Yeah, on policy, yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention that what I see from the investor's perspective, we've been part of some projects where there's a new approach to look at it from a more systematic perspective, quantifiable, using tools like artificial intelligence to evaluate globally very specific policies and the corresponding effect that it will have on the market and the economy. And when we talk about policy, I think we have to touch into ESG and Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, such as, for example, when we look at country strategic national development initiatives, such as Saudi 2030 and others, we see a more holistic perspective that includes environmental, social, governance factors that need to be combined from a systemic and tactical level to properly sustain investments from a long-term perspective as from the investors look at. So I think sustainability is going to be a major topic from the perspective of making investments less risky, as you mentioned, as one of the de-risking strategies, and more viable long-term.
Yeah, just building on that last point you mentioned on risk. And Grayson, I'd love to get your point here, because moving towards financing now. Because here, one of the big things on the dashboard is how to get the right financing mechanisms for high risk, high return regions and projects within these regions. And what are you seeing around that? Is there progress on that in this critical minerals landscape?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of progress that we've seen. I mean, some of the big announcements, for example, have come out of the Orion Fund with the UAE. You see that Orion is also partnered with the DFC. And what this really does is bringing together public and private capital to go into places that private capital traditionally won't go in alone. Government capital is a very, very powerful signal, right? Especially where it is equity over, say, a grant, because it means that another government has skin in the game, is more likely to see the project succeed. I know in the US, the figure that we use the most is that for every dollar of public capital that we put into a project, we want $5 to $6 of private capital. At the end of the day, you're talking about projects that have long timelines to develop, billions of dollars, and they're in places that sometimes have political instability. They have a history of mine expropriation, et cetera. So we are seeing that blended finance is coming to the table. We're seeing institutions like the World Bank Group, which has a partnership with Appian, play a really important role in terms of getting capital into these jurisdictions. Private capital has always been a little bit hesitant with the resource sector as a whole.
Yeah, and I think
Sorry, maybe if I can add
Go
to
ahead.
that and give an example in South Africa of the point that Gracelyn is making is, you know, the biggest topic right now in mining is also on exploration.
Yeah.
We've seen South African government through the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources, together with one of the state-owned entities, putting together, you know, a small fund for exploration of about 400 million rands, which at the time was about $20 million. It's not a lot. But I think the point that you make is about the signal that it sends. And so I think this is another emerging issue in terms of the role of government, in terms of enabling us. Obviously, from an exploration perspective, you need a whole lot more capital for that. But one hopes that that signal, together with other accompanying activities that government has to put in place, and from a South Africa perspective, have to make sure from a policy, the forever emerging cadastral system in South Africa, all of these things need to be put in place, which will then crowd in the rest of private sector capital on the back of the confidence put by government.
And Mzila, I just want to play back one other question to you on this, because the other area where I think there needs to be a lot of progress is around the cost of capital, especially in these high-risk regions, and sometimes it feels like similar risk premium across all of them with the same brush. And is there progress on that? Because that's where a lot of projects actually stumble, and we don't get that supply out.
I can certainly speak with confidence from a South Africa perspective, because it's something which our Reserve Bank is making pretty open, conversation about, including, I guess, the whole issue of the cost of living in terms of inflation rate. So it is something that has now become an issue which I can say is of national concern, because it's not only the Reserve Bank that has spoken about it, but I think we're also getting Minister of Finance expressing concerns about the high cost of capital. And one of the key drivers of this conversation is, given the significant amount of capital required for infrastructure development in the country, and for the amounts of capital required, if it's going to be acquired at current rates of cost of capital, it's going to be impossible to be able to get that. So I think that in itself, I think, is a good indication of progress, to the extent where now, when it comes to budget planning, companies are now planning for a much lower rate of inflation. So the government has spoken. Currently, we are within the 3 to 6% range. We're talking of a midpoint target of 3% inflation. That's significant. And so that's going to begin to manage expectations and influence behavior going forward.
Yeah, so what I like about that, it's carefully managed, communicated, which allows the system to be more fair, let's say, on the cost of capital. And probably something we can hopefully be as a role model for the rest of the region. Richard.
Yeah, so one comment there is that we see structural challenges in terms of the cost of capital, many of them due to country risk biases. And
Yeah.
we see the old school way of looking at the traditional three rating agencies that massively discount, like make the less risk look too big for certain economies, such as emerging markets and FMS super region. And we see emerging initiatives to look beyond the traditional metrics into and use alternative unstructured data and other tools to better assess the risk-return impact equation. And that combined with the challenge that MDBs, such as the World Bank, have a tiny fraction of the capital needed, which is trillions, to really make a difference. So as you mentioned, like the blended finance and other tools combined with these new metrics can potentially start to make a difference to capitalize these important initiatives.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, being an African and speaking to a lot of companies entering Africa, the first discussion is always, there's no one Africa. But sometimes it seems like there's one risk premium, right? I mean, outside South Africa and some of the other big regions. And I think that's an important point. One area actually seems to be a lot of progress is on infrastructure. I think last 2 years, the Lobito corridor, a lot of good progress. The financing, how that's come together has been quite interesting. Simandu and the rail, as an example, I think across the region you're seeing some progress on that. Where else should we see more progress on this, Graceland? Given also your global view, are we moving fast enough, and where else would we accelerate?
Yeah, I think a huge driver of infrastructure development has been the geopolitical competition, because we're going to need to develop new greenfield projects, right? We can't rely only on brownfield projects where there's existing infrastructure ecosystems. So you're seeing this in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, you're seeing this in the DRC, you're seeing this in Peru. New projects are going to require a whole ecosystem of infrastructure. In the US, we tend to call it like the pit to the port. I've got to get it mined, which are often not anywhere near the port over there. Now, we need to split apart, I think, transportation infrastructure from energy infrastructure. And I'm going to start with energy. One of the difficulties that we're seeing is the energy, and I'll speak a little bit more to the African context on this one, is it's driving a certain amount of tension around the mining sector. Mining is an incredibly energy-intensive sector, and a lot of times where we're building energy projects are for mines. And what you still have is an incredible amount of energy inequality in these countries. You go to rural DRC, 1% of the rural DRC is electrified. About 20% of Kinshasa is electrified. You go to Tanzania, rural electrification is still probably sub 20%. So what this means is that you're driving friction, social license to operate challenges. So there's starting to become a newer attention to saying, okay, we can't just build electrification, but we need to make sure that we are building the generation and transmission infrastructure to make sure that communities are getting it, to making sure they're better off for it. But the energy challenge has a long way to go. I mean, if you look at a continent like Africa, you still have 600 million people who don't have access to energy, and that is a fundamental problem as we are trying to develop resources. When we go to transportation infrastructure, again, I mean, one of the wonderful benefits of the Lobito corridor is, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, mining is not an employment generator by and large. It's got a very low labor multiplier. But where you create transportation corridors, you create what is really an enabling node for other industries, whether it's agriculture, which is far more labor intensive, digital connectivity, et cetera. So you see a lot of the economic benefits are actually derived from building those transportation nodes. This is an area where it's actually much easier to get multilateral involvement, to get development partners to work together. Obviously, Lobito was a G7 plus kind of initiative. So this is where I really see the future of economic development, a little bit less so on the mining itself.
Yeah. No, I think you captured it well in terms of logistics. Transport corridors seem to be the one where there's much more of the right collaboration and all of that. But electricity, energy, is where there's a lot more to be done. And Mzila, I think you and I, we spoke about this earlier. There's some good examples and there's some opportunities on this.
No, they are. And there's an expression that I've coined recently of the power and glory of mining. The power really being the kind of change that mining can drive in a country like South Africa. You look at the history of gold mining and what it has done to deliver a city like Johannesburg. And there's examples like that in the US. And I think going forward, there's more of that we can expect. And so in small measures, what we've seen, for instance, is how in one of the provincial province of Limpopo, where there's platinum, chrome, vanadium, and several other commodities that are being mined, how miners have come together to provide for water infrastructure in partnership with government, which infrastructure, I think, whilst the mining company needs, it's also developed in a way that it will also provide for the needs of community. And I think this is where government is represented in this partnership to make sure that the interests of community will be looked at. It's a very innovative structure because the mining companies that have come together are at different stages or different lengths of life of mine remaining. And so the structure is such that, you know, what can be traded is actually the volume of the water pipe that you can trade with. As your mine comes to an end, you can sell that to somebody else who can then buy forward and continue. And the development of this water infrastructure has then given rise to additional opportunities. And in this case, where you started off with water, it's given rise to energy, renewable energy opportunities. And it's given rise to other infrastructure such as roads. And so you're just getting a new township development now that is built on these network infrastructure, which means that there's going to be more sustainability and it would allow for much more long-term planning, which will go beyond mining. And given the fact that this is something that all started with mining.
Yeah.
And so I think the opportunity that I see in terms of this outlook for mining, not only in South Africa, but I think in the rest of the continent, is that with large mining projects, you can have long-term planning at a national level or provincial level, and the existence of mining can give creditworthiness and leveraging of funding for other infrastructure, which then puts government in a very good position. And so what then becomes important is the point you mentioned around policy. Policy that supports mining development, policy that supports other infrastructure development, such as energy, roads, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that what I'm taking away on the infrastructure point, logistics traditionally, historically, across the mining industry globally, has been much more clear in terms of co-investing, shared infrastructure, all of that. Power and energy hasn't been as much, but there's definitely some examples which we can build on, and probably want to see more progress on the energy side. I want to shift to another topic which I think is a little bit more difficult, which
Yes.
the progress has been a little bit challenging, quite challenging, which is this on the sustainability side, but specifically on traceability. And Richard, I think you mentioned sustainability earlier when you were talking about one of the areas of progress. But on this traceability point, am I wrong, or do you see actually some progress here? And we'd love to get your view.
Yes, well, I think it goes hand in hand when we look at traceability and sustainability. But I think, in particular to the area that you mentioned, green energy, where we see very high priority, given the high demand for AI data centers, for example, that are realigning the geostrategic priorities based on this new geoeconomic reality. I think the imperative to create green projects where we can, for some of them, enable the creation of things like green bonds and SDG bonds and new innovative methods that can potentially, again, de-risk capital and reduce the cost of capital. It's going to become a very critical part of this process. I think the times where we have this hidden risk and this hidden, as the investors will call it, the risk factors are gone, and now we have a lot of data available with alternative data. through AI and including alternative third-party sources that will enable new ways to look at risk and make these projects more attractive to long-term investors.
Thank you. And Gracelyn, on this traceability point, what is possible here? I mean, are we being too extreme, too high in expectations, or can we actually put something together here and make progress on it, and especially taking the customer lens?
I think historically we haven't paid attention to traceability because regardless of where the minerals came from, they went to China. And once you throw everything into a big smelter in China, it's very difficult to go back and pull that apart in terms for the end user to go, you know, this is the path that you took. I think what's happening now is there is pressure globally, I don't have to tell anyone in this room, to have more diversified supply chains. And there is an incentive to end users to source from certain places. Right? If our automotives, our defense companies, our chips companies have an incentive or a requirement from governments to source from certain supply chains, that has to imply that they know where their minerals are coming from and they can track it from the mine to the manufactured good. So you're seeing now that there is an imperative, a security imperative on end users to be able to trace it. And pressure has historically been a very good driver of innovation. You actually go back and trace minerals for 100 years, our best innovations actually came from periods of conflict. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is we're starting to realize that without traceability, conflict will continue. And we see this with the DRC and Rwanda, right? You saw the tripartite agreement between Rwanda, the DRC, and the US, but you know, it's really hard to come down and implement peace without being able to develop a traceability system in terms of supplying these minerals that are now fueling conflict. So from an American perspective, again, is, you know, we have this great minerals agreement, but the minerals agreement is linked to the peace agreement, and if you've turned on the news, you know there's no peace still, which means that it is an unenforceable agreement. So we are now seeing traceability as being vital to reducing conflict, particularly in areas where there are mineral interests. So I think that there is a push, and I think you are going to see more innovation, but it's not easy. And the last thing is that it is also very difficult to put a price premium on something until it is a strong enough system.
Yeah, makes sense.
So I think the topic is an interesting one. As the two speakers were talking, what came to my mind is that there's different dimensions to traceability. The one that we tend to speak the most about is from the point of view of ethical sourcing and avoiding conflict products and commodities. But there's also the other dimension from a social environmental impact in terms of really needing to know that the conduct of miners in this case is it follows certain principles. And that's one I will actually focus on a little bit. And here I have a particular interest in impact investing, because I think from what I've seen in impact investing is that there is an element of traceability if you look at the principles that they put in place. And one of those that I really like is this whole concept of intentionality. And what comes in intentionality is, I think, first and foremost, be clear on why you want to do what you want to do, and therefore put in place the reference points that you will use as you make progress towards investing and developing your project. And so I think maybe by way of my engineering training, I like things that are tangible. And I think by making sure that you've identified clear impact metrics that you're going to measure yourself on, you're then able to account for the work that you've done. I think the conversation so far on traceability and ethical sourcing and avoiding conflict, I think it's still relevant. But I think there's quite a huge emphasis on technology. Not to say that it's not important or irrelevant, but it shouldn't be seen as that which will take away from the continuing need for operators to operate with ethics and with appropriate ESG standards. So it remains difficult, but there are areas where we're making progress. And I think what I like about the impact investing approach, it is a little bit more tangible. I think it's about seeing a difference where we want to see a difference in terms of the positive impact of mining on people, and particularly the positive impact of mining on the environment as well.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is a little bit more nuanced. It's not just, okay, let's trace everything and report. It's actually, there's proactivity from the mining companies. There's, as you invest, how do you set that up from the start, which makes it actually more fit for purpose for that project, for that commodity,
Yeah.
for that region, rather than saying we're going to have a broad brush and then no one actually follows these. Good. So just in closing, last 5 minutes, a question we didn't actually discuss before, which is, what would you see where, if you take 2026, we're at the beginning of the year, all these topics, we talked about financing, innovation, policy, we didn't get to talk about talent and R&D, geology, we didn't talk about sustainability and traceability. What's your hope for 2026 and where you want to see the most progress in some of these? For me, I mean, I'll start since I give you time to think about it. I'd love to see progress on the things that, especially mining companies that can control, which is technology, because there's a lot that can be done, and also in achieving productivity and through that creating more transparency and control. And I think as well on the talent side, because that's something where, once again, it's not something where any stakeholder in the system, the ecosystem, has to wait for another. Government can play a role. The industry bodies like Minerals Council and in other countries, Chamber of Commerce can play a role. And mining companies for sure can play a role because they have to, because there's challenges with talent, there's technology that's coming in even more, and there's an opportunity, and there's a need for local community development and building the skills in that as well. So that would be my answer to that question, and hopefully gave you time to think about it. Richard, let me start with you. Where would you see the priority for the year?
Yeah, I think for this coming year, I would like to see renewed sense of urgency from policymakers to make the necessary adjustments to prioritize this very important sector, and then continue with these geoeconomic priorities that we see now, where the future of the world economy, from the perspective of green energy, electric batteries, artificial intelligence, and this geostrategic warfare happening, where critical minerals are going to play a very critical role, and therefore we expect to see investors, both private and public even, perhaps taking a bigger risk, given this new factor into the equation, to increase capital mobilization in the sector and overcome all the immediate challenges to make a real difference and expand it for the future.
Thank you. Graceland?
I'd like to see a couple good announcements of miners going into hard places. So back in March of 2025, when Kathleen Quirk of Freeport said, hey, I'd be interested in going to the DRC under the right conditions, that was a really powerful signal, right? What it did was it mobilized government efforts, it mobilized financing, it mobilized bilateral cooperation, and it really put the DRC in as a serious mining contender after a period of instability. When the private sector is willing to go, and when they're willing to be clear that they're willing to go, it is a really powerful catalyzing tool. So I'd like to see some new jurisdictions. I will say I think 2025 was up for Argentina. I mean, you saw Glencore announce a $13 billion investment. Newmont, they're all lining up now in Argentina. I'd like to see more Argentinas, right, as a place that has never produced copper but is now going to be a major copper player. I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to go past the talking to see the capital announcements in harder jurisdictions.
I like that.
So I think I'll add a third one to the first two that you mentioned, and it would be geology.
Yeah.
And here what I want to say is a wise geologist, if you find such, this is a dig at geologists being a mining engineer, a wise geologist said, whilst it's in the ground, it's rock. And why that is important is because I think one of the things that a lot of African political leaders mention at these conferences is how wealthy the continent is beneath the surface, but people are poor above surface. Well, we need to translate that into human prosperity. And so I think to the extent that geology brings government and private sector together for the exploration and the eventual translation of those minerals to human prosperity, I think progress on that for me will be a good sign. And then technology and skills combined, I think, are also important. And a good example for me is that I think firstly when I look at South Africa in terms of how mining pretty much shaped the complexion of the mining industry and the structure of South African society, given that 100 years ago there was a need for low-skilled people to be able to extract the gold. Society of South Africa was structured around that. Given where we are with the opportunities ahead of us with mining and the skills level and the technology and innovation input into mining, mining in South Africa, once again, if not everywhere else, has an opportunity to reshape society. And rather than focusing or continue to depend on low skills, we actually need to shift some mindset and understand the level of skill, which is going to be much higher than we've had in the past, that will be required to drive mining and for mining to have an impact going forward. So those will be the three where I'd like to see a lot more progress on.
Great. I mean, just to close it out then, so Mzila, you're going back to the main point, right, which is geology.
Yeah.
How do we make that more transparent, understand it? Because without that, we can't do much mining. But then on top of that, the tech and the people, which are the most important resources and capacity that's needed to actually make it all happen. And government and policy, let's see some progress. And mining companies being bold and making the big steps so that it creates that progress and that momentum. So we'll see you in 2027 at Future Minerals Forum, and we can check how the progress has been on some of these. But thanks for sharing your insights and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
we left the round table hanging. It didn't go anywhere, right? I thought it would be some like real discussion about what can happen next.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's session, or I would say last session, titled Way Forward and Recommendations. This is the state of the sector. Very happy to be here with you this afternoon. My name is Patricia Bingotto, Senior Expert at McKinsey & Company's Metals and Mining Practice. And I have the pleasure of sharing this panel discussion with three key contributors to the FMF Barometer. We have Ariane Delanoux, Executive Director Consulting at S&P Global, Hamid Rashid, Executive Chairman at Global AI, and Chris Coulter, Chief Executive Officer at GlobeScan. The Future Minerals Forum's Barometer aims to operationalize the FMF's agenda by including focused analysis of supply and demand trends, identification of vulnerabilities, evaluation of geopolitical and macroeconomic impacts, and a forward-looking approach to help manage risks while securing long-term supply. It will track progress across the mineral value chain with particular attention to sustainability, transparency, and policy effectiveness. We have a first edition of the Barometer, and thank you, gentlemen, for your contributions. I think without you, the Barometer wouldn't have been possible, and it has been a great pleasure working with you all. But let's talk about what the readers should be expecting in the next edition. I'll start with you, Ariane. S&P developed the Critical Minerals Price Index, which you aim to track over the next months and years. Copper has crossed the $13,000 per ton mark. How is this development, but also the development of other price or commodity prices contributing to positive signals to supplier regions?
Thank you, Patricia. Great to be here. So it's an interesting question, right? Because we developed the Critical Mineral Index for the purpose of the FMF Barometer. As you might know, S&P is also a price reporting agency, and so we publish daily prices for a lot of the critical minerals that are, very important for the super region. And when thinking about, how do we represent this in a way that provides a state of the health of the sector and the health of critical minerals in the super region, it's really hard, because, not only you have new critical minerals, some critical minerals you don't have the price assessments, even so we focused the critical mineral index on a battery material, right? So whatever is used for an NCM battery, but even then, those requirements change. We see the battery technology, battery chemistries change. So how do you monitor the critical mineral health from a price perspective that actually encompasses all of the critical minerals that actually can bring, value to the investors and value to the super region? So I think, looking forward, there's going to be questions around, is this NCM and looking at nickel, cobalt, manganese prices, is this the right metric to look at activity and health of the commodity market for the super region? And I think we might see some changes on this, on what do we include in the critical mineral index. And as we developed, so Platts is developing a rare earth price assessment for next year. And so we're going to have to follow which commodities are becoming more important in the region and how this is going to change how we measure the health of the pricing market, which, as you might know, it drives investments, it drives exploration spend, it drives, revenue for the countries. So it's a good monitor of measurement.
Yeah, and thank you, Ariane, for mentioning the fact that this index might have to be adapted to next year's reality or future years' realities. We all know that price signals are key for investors to figure out where they should be investing, long-term price forecasts are even more important to support the economics of a project. Chris, I would love to get your perspective because you have been interviewing different industry participants to be able to get a sense of how the industry is doing and what it should be doing. If we focus specifically on market signals, right? What are the right market signals that need to be there, or how should we think about them next year in the next edition of the barometer?
Great, thanks, Patricia, and thank you for all your leadership on the barometer. You were our captain and conductor, and amazing to get us to where we are here today. Yeah, so I think like the price index, we did a bunch of stakeholder interviews and trying to understand how stakeholders understood these 6 different enablers that FNMF had come up with. And I guess is an index, it will become an index of sorts going forward, and this mélange of these things together, just as the inputs, what is the right mix? And these enablers are important. One was on financing, quite obvious. Second, on policy, obviously quite important as well. Sustainability, fundamental, talent, infrastructure, and technology. And the signals from these stakeholder interviews, who came from business and leaders in mining companies and industry associations and governments and investors, and also some academics and thought leaders as well, inside the super region and outside, important because we wanted inclusive perspectives and voices. From that, there is strong consensus that this demand-supply challenge we have is a huge opportunity, and there's a great deal of enthusiasm. However, there's also a great deal of understanding how risky this entire venture is and how we need dramatically informed calibration and coordination to pull this off, right? There's like above ground, the sociology and the complexity of getting all those enablers right is foundational and fundamental. And the way we do that, the how of the process of enacting this, is of top of mind concern for many of the stakeholders we interviewed. And there are some tensions. Just one example of one tension is timing. There's this urgency to try and develop the supply of critical minerals. However, as we all know in this industry, to do this effectively and thoughtfully in an enduring way takes time and overinvestment to a degree in some of the stakeholder nuance in local communities, with local governments, with national governments, and coordination. And that's one of the risks that stakeholders are very cognizant of too. Will we do this in a hapdash way, slapdash way, or will we actually do it in a thoughtful way that leads to an enduring supply that's powerful?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And Hamid, let's come back perhaps to the fundamentals, I will call them. Global AI has effectively defined the baseline, so the fact base, so the baseline against which we will be measuring progress over the next years in this barometer. Could you talk about the macro outlook that would be reflective of positive signals as we think about developing the supply chains that are needed to support effectively the supplier countries?
Thank you, Patricia. First of all, I should thank you for the coordination and the leadership that you provided to all of us. It was a tri-continental collaboration, North America, Europe, and Asia. So it was at times challenging, but I believe we did a great report, and we look forward to getting feedback on the report. So this is the first iteration of the barometer report, and we would look forward to building on what we have produced in terms of the baseline. And Chris just mentioned the 6 enablers that we have in the report. We have to track the progress, and the most important sort of backdrop for that sort of baseline is the macro outlook. Yeah. The macro outlook is sort of a moving target right now. We can have a short-term macro perspective that we are seeing right now, global growth conditions, but there are also long-term trends. If we focus too much on the short term, we'll see a lot of volatility. And we have to really separate the two. What is the trend growth versus what is the immediate short-term reaction to global geopolitical risk or other policy uncertainties? And this is where I think our forward direction would be that we should look at both, so that we don't give wrong signals. Think about copper price or gold price right now. We have a significant spike in prices, but is it a long-term trend versus is a short-term reaction, market reaction, driven by what's happening? Just look at the copper market. Copper price is all-time high right now, partly because, not because of geopolitical uncertainty, but also the spike in demand for data centers. The US produced 63 gigawatts of additional data centers last year, and that required between 2 and 3 million tons of copper. And that was unexpected demand on these countries, copper-producing countries in the super region, and that pushed up the copper price, which is good news. It's a price signal. But we also have to look at the long-term price signals in order to inform the policymakers. They don't respond to the short-term spikes, because that may create a lot of volatility even on the investment side. We don't want that. The FMF as a forum is trying to advise and guide and the dialogues among the member states so that they can make more prudent and relevant decisions on the policy side. And the barometer would be a sort of a guideline for them, sort of providing some vision, near-term vision. This is where the market is going. This is where Orion just mentioned that the critical mineral price index. So we have to really look at each and every indicator and provide more granular sort of understanding of what the direction is. Look at infrastructure. Infrastructure is very, very important for investment. We have provided some benchmark for infrastructure, including energy generation and consumption. But then we have to go industry by industry where the energy shortages are more acute. And we suspect, and we have found in the data, that energy shortages are quite acute in the mining and mineral sector. And if we want to really build a processing capacity, beneficiation in Africa, we have to really focus on easing the energy shortages. And so in the next report, we would really focus on what is the state of the energy generation and energy supply to the mining and mineral sector, not just upstream, but also midstream.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of direction that we want to take so that there's more guidance for the policymakers so that they can take the right decisions.
Thank you, Hamid. Orion, S&P tracks exploration spend globally across commodities, and we know that for supplier countries, starting with exploration is key. What needs to happen to actually increase exploration in the region?
It's a good question. I mean, so we follow exploration spend through surveys. Year on year, we publish a exploration spend review, and so the 2025 numbers are, I think, overall $12.6 billion are spent on mining exploration across the world, which is roughly the same as last year in 2024. Then when you get into the numbers and you know, as I mentioned, like, you might expect, you follow the commodity prices, right? So most of the spend on exploration is done on gold. If you take, and that's always been the case. So if you take that away, then you look at, you know, where else are explorers spending their cash on exploration. And, you know, when we talk about exploration, it's a cash burn, right? It's no revenue. You only get revenue when you start operating. So you have to make the investment decisions with a different mindset than you would if you are producing assets or if you're doing near field exploration where you already know exactly the geology, the regulatory system, and the infrastructure. So when you look at, you know, grassroots exploration, which is unfortunately only 20% of overall exploration spend this year, grassroots exploration needs, you know, a stable, visible, like, regulatory and fiscal system for the explorers, which, you know, in a way is completely different than what it is for the producers, because the explorers, and we were in the roundtable earlier, the explorers, they get the money to spend it on drilling. They get the money to spend it on drilling and not on anything around like G&A or other, you know, regulatory bypasses. So you need the system and the ecosystem to enable this to happen, right? Like money going straight from the investor or the bank or whoever's funding that exploration company into the ground. So, you know, for the super region, it's going to be interesting, right? Because you can only have a mining industry that is well developed if you've started with the exploration, you've started with enabling companies to actually not be worried about investing some capital, not knowing if they can take the capital out of the country. And so with this, you need the ecosystem, you need potentially a financial system that you trust, you need players and partners in the super region that have been successful at doing this in the past. And so as we look at the super region, for Latin America, it's already a very well mature mining region. You've got Chile, Argentina, Brazil that have done mining for a long time. When you look at sub-Saharan Africa or Africa in general, you want to make sure that you monitor which countries are seeing an increased exploration spend and why. And so the why will be either commodity prices or the geology or the ease of doing business and investing in that region or that country. So those are the two things that we want to monitor when we do our next 2026 survey. And we've seen progress. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the fastest growing in terms of exploration spend with an extra 100 million spent on exploration compared to last year. There are some countries like Mali that have seen an increase in exploration spend compared to last year. So we're looking at why, and we're going to monitor which countries are seeing progress and which countries are falling behind, because I think that's a good measure of the health of the sector.
And thanks, Arjen. You mentioned ease of doing business. And Chris, I would like you to talk specifically about policy and the regulatory requirements that we should hope to see evolving over the next year, to support exploration efforts based on the stakeholder surveys that you have run.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so risk is the challenge, and de-risking to try and get the flow going and the investments happening, and policy is fundamental for that, of course. The stakeholders gave feedback that there is existing good scaffolding in many policies. However, there needs to be, to allow for the region to be more integrated, there needs much more harmony on policy. And that requires giving up some national approaches, which is very challenging in a political context. And then we also need harmonization on the sustainability side of things. And I think much of the de-risking can be done through the lens of ESG and sustainability. This is aligned with social license to operate and operational integrity, ultimately. And as Mozilla, you were saying in your last panel, it also requires people get the benefits of this. And without that, then everything is very precarious. So harmonizing policy, aligning around policy, ensuring that sustainability is core to that. And Hamid, in the analysis you did, there in the super regions, there have been a good proliferation of ESG requirements and policies. Enforcement's critical. Transparency of these things are critical. And then we also have the opportunity to leverage something like ICMM's integrated reporting standard to adopt that fully, simplify some of these policies to allow for investor confidence and businesses to really see that there's a good place to invest in a long-term framing.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. There's one topic that I would like to discuss, which I feel is not getting enough attention. And the critical minerals framework that FMF has developed includes, the enablers, as you had mentioned. Infrastructure definitely got a lot of attention. Funding also. But let's talk about talent. And I'll talk to you specifically. I'd like to ask you, Hamid. Talent is a key enabler. Now, what would need to happen to support mineral value chains developments in the super region, specifically from a talent lens?
Patricia, I think this is a very important issue for not only to optimize the benefits of the mineral sector, but also attract investments. But without local talent, it's very difficult for foreign investors to go in. And we just scanned the horizon in terms of human capital, level of education in those corridor countries in the super region, but also we plan to expand it to also look at the Latin American context, the jurisdictions, those jurisdictions are far more advanced in terms of local talent and local talent pool that can make investment more attractive in those jurisdictions. So what would be the ideal way to monitor the progress? We have done, for example, scanned the number of engineers and metallurgical engineers that are available in the country. We just heard that in China, there are every year 20,000 engineers are like mining engineers. In the sub-Saharan Africa or the super region, there are less than 20,000 mining engineers altogether. So we have to really scale up the efforts, and mining engineers should not grow like in vacuum. You have to look at the demand side. For example, exploration activities would actually generate more demand. But what we're seeing right now, there's not enough quick response on the supply side. Institutions are not expanding. If you look at that, mining activities have increased significantly in the super region over the last 2-3 years. But number of mining schools, we heard in the kingdom, they launched a mining school yesterday, which is a great sort of step forward. But we would like to see more mining schools, mining institutions that would produce local talent. But also, one important aspect of those mining schools they are the sort of disseminator of knowledge and technology. Because when you have a training institution, they often would bring foreign experts and foreign expertise and knowledge, and then it would spill over to the local community, local mining sector. So I think this dynamic approach has to be there, because both the emphasis on mining education and also building centers of excellence, and we would closely monitor how they support each other. And one last point I want to add here is that I think the report, as we go forward, would probably go in the direction of seeing the upstream, midstream, and downstream as a continuum, not as separate processes. Because when you look at the lack of upstream mining exploration investments or spend, this is probably driven by the choke point in midstream. Midstream is where gold doesn't have any problem with exploration, because there's always a demand for gold, significant demand, and gold can be processed very quickly and brought to the marketplace. You have a rate of return. It's not just high rate of return, but a quick rate of return. That's what makes gold exploration very attractive. Whereas you can go into copper exploration, it may be a 10-year lag. So unless we address the choke points, the midstream, and this is where the super region is extremely focused, because we have to expand these midstream activities, building more processing plants, refining plants, smelters, and that would create also a lot of demand for local talents. Because when you're just digging ores from the ground, you don't really need a lot of local talent. But when you're smelting or when you're processing, you need a lot of local expertise. And this is where we need to focus. We need to make sure that these 3 stages are linked properly, and that would generate demand for local mining schools and local talents.
I think, can I add something to your point? Yeah. I mean, when looking at like the issue of talent or shortage of talent, I think the very interesting thing is, it's in the interest of everyone in that industry, because when you look at the hard fact is a shortage of talent is either lower productivity or higher cost, because you have to pay more. Ultimately, an engineer will, if the cost, if the money is there and is much higher than tech, the engineer will go into that sector, right? The thing is, the shortage, right, drives lower productivity, because you have to fix or meet the needs that you have with, maybe not the quality that you want for those processes or mining. So the shortage of talent creates increased labor costs ultimately for the industry. And, in an industry where, copper is used in electrification, in data centers, in buildings, like, a higher cost of labor means a higher cost of power, a higher cost of, anything that you're buying, right? So it's got a knock-on effect downstream and down to the consumer, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is where, if I may just quickly respond to what Warren said, I think it's very important for us also to hone into that point that when you look at low productivity, as economists would look at productivity as a cost, right? Low productivity is a cost, direct cost. And that cost is an important element in entire investment decisions at every stage. And that is reflected in weighted average cost of capital, WACC. And we would like to monitor how the weighted average cost of capital across different jurisdictions vary, because the cost of capital is what determines investment. And this is not just the interest rates, but it's the cost of capital in terms of labor productivity, institutional quality, ESG. All of this should be factored in to understand what is the true cost of capital in those jurisdictions. And they're very high. And one of the points, focus should be how to reduce the cost of debt capital. Because you can't reduce the cost of equity capital, because equity is what the return they would expect as investors. But debt capital cost has to be reduced through different measures, policy measures, and improving the quality of the labor force, especially the skilled labor that would be needed in this sector. So I think these all are very interconnected, and this is where I think that we see the direction for the barometer report in future.
Yeah, and I'm sure we can spend the whole afternoon talking about where the barometer should go. But Chris, I'll give you perhaps a final word. If you had to describe what the FMF barometer could look like in its next edition, how would you do it?
I think this is where we want to have the granularity that you both referenced, monitoring going forward. We want to have real feedback from primary stakeholders inside the super region, outside, in a quantitative way. And we want to be able to monitor and assess progress. Where is there flow of performance improvement and moving forward? Where are the friction points? Because there's lots of friction points here. And just to wrap up on the thing, stakeholders were, I think, the collective wisdom of stakeholders told us a number of things we've talked about. Coordination, collaboration being fundamental, moving at the speed of trust is critical. And then the talent side, they're very wary of the reputation of the entire industry and the entire endeavor. And I think we have the dawn of a global cause is the strapline of the conference. What we need to do is create a stronger vision and purpose for all of this as a wrapper. That'll get kids going to university to study mining going forward. That will allow some of the other elements of skepticism that exist in our fragmented world. And so we do need to find a purpose, a vision that is tied to all these outcomes that we know we need. We need a green energy transition. This is indisputable. Science tells us that. That's what this can deliver. We need to drive and mobilize technology to increase economic growth and development in a much more equitable fashion. If we just view the tactical and short-term elitist views in many ways of what people want, investment returns, ROI, all the rest of it, we're going to miss the entire opportunity to bring this together in almost a Marshall Plan type framework, which is that's the big shot we have. If we try and fragment and be tactical on these things, the house will collapse, is what stakeholders told us.
And thank you, Chris. To our audience today, if you haven't had the chance to get a copy of the barometer, I would encourage you to do so. It is very well written, has great content, fully digestible, and you may get a copy online from the FMF website. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today, and thank you for the great collaboration on this barometer, and I look forward to the next edition. Thank you.